Hello, awesome students, and welcome to Lesson 5 on conflict. Your essential questions for today are: how does conflict drive the plot of a story, book, movie, or play? How does an author use conflict to engage the reader? And how can I use conflict to improve my own writing? So what I want you to do is be able to identify the different types of conflict, be able to give examples of how they are shown in a play, short story, movie, or book, and then actually understand that when an author uses levels of conflict acted out through his or her characters, it really engages the reader and makes you guys enjoy what's in front of you as you read, based on this conflict and how the characters react to the conflict. And that is all the writer doing this. The writer, to keep you engaged, does this intentionally. Okay, this is good writing. So I want you to be able to apply all that to your own writing. The anchor we're working with is demonstrating an understanding of key ideas and details in literature. First step is to pause and think. What is your favorite movie, and what was the conflict in it? Take a moment, you can press pause, think about it. Favorite movie and the conflict. An example is Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. My children watched that this morning in the rain. And there are these big storms that are causing huge food particles to fall from the sky. The entire movie is set around making these storms go away, and how do they get them to stop. Now, what do I do with this conflict in that story? I identified my favorite movie and the conflict in it. I want to now characterize that type of conflict. So there are 5 types of conflict, and they're on the left column here, 5 different types of conflict. There's character versus character, character versus nature, character versus circumstances, character versus society, and character versus self. I'm going to walk through each of those with you and give you an example. Character versus character conflict is when the main character struggles against other characters. Examples of this are when Harry Potter is against Voldemort, or Edward versus Jacob, or Elsa versus Anna. Character versus nature is when the main character struggles against nature. For example, the sheriff versus Jaws, that big mean shark in Jaws. You have Flint Lockwood, that's the movie I mentioned this morning, in Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, battling the falling food. And then you have other movies where storms, twisters, storms, those were very big. The apocalypse have come about lately, character versus nature. You have character versus circumstances, where the main character struggles against fate or the circumstances of life facing him or her. An example of that is Sleeping Beauty versus the Evil Fairy's Curse, Ebenezer Scrooge versus the future, or even Elsa versus her ice powers. Next, you have character versus society, where the main character struggles against ideas, practices, or customs of other people or groups. And this can be exemplified in Katniss versus the Society of Panem, or Anne Frank versus the Nazi government. So those are societies that have been set up that these characters have to go against. And then finally, the one that might be most familiar to you is character versus self. In character versus self conflict, the main character struggles with himself or herself, with his or her ideas of right or wrong. A character might have physical limitations, and a character might struggle against the choices he or she has to make. And you guys do this all the time. Should I do my homework, or should I go out and play? Should I do my homework and study for that quiz, or should I just wing it? So you guys are constantly going back and forth between character versus self, just in adolescence in general. But authors often write about characters who do that throughout their novels. An example of this in writing is Edward versus himself, whether or not he's going to kill Bella. Harry versus himself on whether or not he's going to confront Voldemort and be killed. And then you have Katniss and herself, will she be the actual Mockingjay? So if you guys have read some of those novels, they should appeal to you. And if you haven't read them, I recommend them. They're wonderful. So those are the 5 types of conflict that you should be able to identify when you come across a play, a movie, even a TV show, a book, a short story. You'll find those 5 types of conflict that characters go through, and the authors particularly use them to increase their the interest in their novels. What I want you to do is think of Romeo and Juliet. There are lots of types of conflict in the play. I'm going to, in tonight's homework, you'll see an activity after this, this lesson. You're going to identify conflict, the type of conflict that I give you. You're going to find examples of it in Romeo and Juliet. And then you're going to make a prediction on how do you think this conflict will end. So what you're going to see is what type of conflict, why did this conflict arise, how do we see it in the play, how will it end. The Capulets and Montagues versus the Prince. We read a little bit about that in a previous lesson. So what I've done is I've given you the example of where the prince is shouting to the town, specifically Montague and Capulet, if you ever disturb my streets again, you'll pay for it with your lives. He gets so angry with them for creating this bloodshed all the time, Capulets versus Montagues, causing the fighting in the streets. He yells at everybody and threatens death upon those who continue to fight. That is what he's going to do. I also want you guys, look at the prologue. If you guys are having questions on how do you think the conflict will end or what type of conflict this is, I would recommend that you go to the prologue because the prologue does give us some answers. Okay, hint, hint. So by the end of exploring this, you would look for a piece of text that would support that type of conflict. You would fill in the chart for your type of conflict. So by the end of your exploration, it might look something like this. What type of conflict is the Capulets and the Montagues versus the prince? That is character versus character. Okay? The Capulets and Montagues are the characters versus the prince, who is another character. Why did this conflict arise? Well, it says in the prologue that the conflict has been going on for ages, but no one is sure why. How do we see this conflict in the play? That's where you're going to look at your play and give me actual lines from your play to support this conflict. So I wrote, in Prince's speech to the families is where we see that conflict. Here are his exact words. I'll have you tortured if you don't put down your swords and listen to your angry prince. Pretty demonstrative. And then finally, the last column, how do you predict this conflict will end? Well, the prologue says the feud will end with Romeo and Juliet's deaths. So I used the literature I had in Act 1 to answer these questions. You're going to pull from today's lesson on conflict with the 5 types of conflict to identify the type of conflict it is, use your text to show me where you see the examples of that, and then use your own intuition to predict how the conflict will end. You should now be able to do the homework for this evening. If you have questions, please feel free to contact me or attend the live session this week. Good luck, guys, and let me know if you need anything.